Hi, and welcome to this lecture on constructivist learning theory. Now, constructivism is one of the foundational learning theories within education, so it's important that you understand it as a base because so much of what we know and what we do in education these days can find its foundations within constructivist learning theory. So we're going to have a look at the theory, obviously. We're going to have a look at some key terms, why we would use constructivist learning theory to help guide our teaching, and then the implications for that. But before we begin, I just want to define the way that we talk about theories within academia, within science. So when we talk about a theory, we're really talking about an interconnected system of ideas which conforms and agrees with ideas within the theory itself, but also ideas outside of the theory, which is supported by multiple lines of evidence coming from different fields supporting it. But more importantly, that the theory has explanatory power, being able to explain and describe phenomena that we know, but also be able to predict how things will be in future scenarios, for example. And so when I talk about explanatory power, I've got the definitions there, and also predictive power. So a theory, which is a system of ideas, should be able to explain, but it also should be able to predict and make predictions about how things will play out within certain scenarios. And in this case, how things play out in terms of education. Now, constructivism goes all the way back to Jean Piaget. And so what I recommend that you do is that you pause briefly and watch this video from Khan Academy. And then once you're done, come back into the video because I will go into another explanation of these key terms. So a schema, assimilation, and accommodation as concepts key within constructivism. So welcome back. Okay. So in terms of a theory, constructivism conceptualizes that learning occurs in a particular way. So within constructivism, we talk about schemas, and schemas are the ideas which exist within your head. So you'll have a schema around dogs, around mathematics, around the way the world works, around the way that you fit into the world. Okay? So we can think of a schema as if we are decorating a Christmas tree. So the tree itself is kind of the raw architecture within your brain, and as you learn new information, as you learn new skills, you add baubles to your Christmas tree. So as you learn, you add more and more baubles. You might add a star to the top. You'll add tinsel. So the connectedness of the different ideas is how constructivism conceptualizes the way that we learn new ideas. So for example, for a topic that you know a lot about, it's a very, very richly decorated Christmas tree with lots of baubles, you've got some Christmas lights, you've got tinsel, and they all work in harmony. They all hang together within a network. Okay? So we'll talk about this process of adding baubles, of adding decorations to your Christmas tree as assimilation. So the more baubles you add to it, the more tinsel that you add to it, the bigger that your scheme grows and the more richly connected it becomes. Now, eventually what happens is that the more baubles that you add, the more tinsel that you add, you all of a sudden get deeper insights into the way that the decorations hang together on the tree, and what you end up with is a fundamental shift. So keeping this analogy of a Christmas tree, so you're adding baubles, you're adding decorations to your Christmas tree, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually there'll come a point where you have that aha moment, where there is a radical reorganization of how those ideas fit together, and it's virtually that the Christmas tree changes into a completely different tree. So it goes from a Christmas tree into, say, I don't know, a peach tree, for example. There is a fundamental shift in terms of the nature of that schema, of the way that the various things hang together. So we've got the addition of more and more skills and knowledge to a particular schema, which we call assimilation. We are just assimilating knowledge. And then accommodation is where that next step, that all of a sudden you see the phenomena that you're looking at in a completely different way. It's a mind shift. So you can think of learning in this process where what we've got is assimilation. We're adding more and more knowledge to our schema, adding more and more. So what we end up with is an equilibrium eventually. Now, what happens is a new situation comes along, and what that does is it fundamentally shifts the way that we think about the program, because we get a sense of uneasiness. So we go from a state of equilibrium to a state of disequilibrium, and it's within this state of disequilibrium where we get that fundamental shift, where the penny drops, you get the epiphany, the aha moment. There's a million and one things that we call it, but we go from a state where we're comfortable, we get exposed to a new situation, we become equilibrated within that state, and then we reach this new state of accommodation. And it occurs in a cycle. So we go through cycles of assimilating new knowledge, coming across a new situation which challenges us, and then we reach a new state, a new level of understanding, a new level of nirvana, for example. Okay? And we go round and round and round. So this is how constructivists conceptualize that learning occurs at the conceptual level. Now, you'll remember that when we talked about theory earlier, that a theory needs to have not only internal consistency, so all the ideas work together, but they need to have external validity and agreement with other ideas. And because we're talking about a biological phenomenon, the place where we should be headed is that the ideas that we talk about at this level of schema and assimilation and accommodation, they should agree with underlying biological systems that we're looking at. Okay? So down at the cellular level, what we've got is a whole bunch of neurons which are talking to each other. So you've got some images here, so you can see there's there's that big colourful one. So that just shows you just how richly connected neurons are. So individual colours are individual neurons, and you can see it's a tangled web. It's a very organised tangled web, but it's a tangled web. Over here you can see there's projecting fibres, so you've got communicating fibres between the back of the brain and the midbrain and the prefrontal cortex and down at the midbrain. So you've got these projecting fibres, these superhighways of how different neurons connect. So as you go through those cycles of assimilation and accommodation, you've got these neurons down at the cellular level connecting and unconnecting, strengthening connections, breaking away other connections, and all of the phenomena that we understanding at this high level that we understand at education absolutely occurs down at the cellular level. So here's some more videos if you want to pause and you want to go and watch those to get a bit more of a biological understanding of what's going on. So we can actually see assimilation and accommodation down at the cellular level, and there's studies such as this one which have been done. So you can see as you add more and more information to your schema through the process of assimilation, we can actually map that, yeah? And we can actually see that. So we go from neurons which aren't connected to other neurons, all of a sudden connecting and strengthening those connections. So over time, you should be able to see that if you do brain scans, okay? Now this is actually quite interesting, because not only does it show the learning process, but it also shows what a stable schema looks like at the very end, and what happens when you go through the act of recalling, running electricity through those neurons to get them to refire so that you can recall information. I'll touch more on that in a little bit later. Okay? Here's another interesting TED talk about the role of boredom in terms of learning. Go and watch it. Here's another good article that you can go read by Bizra and colleagues. And what they concluded was that self-explanations are really powerful learning techniques. If you want to learn something then effectively, then self-explanations should play a role in that. Okay? So let's talk about constructivism and its implications for your teaching. So constructivists, they conceive that as learners, we move from a place of being novice, of not knowing much about a topic, not being very good at a skill, and over time, we move towards the expert end. How fast you move along that continuum from novice to expert really depends upon time on court. Okay? Now, this guy, Ericsson, you may have heard of the saying being thrown around that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert, plus or minus. But what that really is saying is that become an expert, you've really got to put in the time. There's no way around it. There's no shortcuts. There's pretty much, you know, this limit, this set number of hours, not exactly 10,000, but you do need to put in time to actually learn a skill or a piece of knowledge. Where teachers come into it is that we are super important in that process because we help guide students along that continuum. We understand the continuum, we understand the barriers, and what we do as teachers is we provide scaffolding to help students along that process. Here's a quote by Richard Feynman that if you want to learn material, or if you want to help students progress along that continuum, then having students teach that piece of knowledge or that skill to somebody else is a really effective means for learning. Okay? So there's an interesting quote. And concept mapping. Concept mapping I'll talk more about in future lectures, that puts in visual form the schema that we have in our brain so others can interrogate it, is another powerful learning tool which is supported by the literature within the constructivism. Okay? Now, in terms of the scaffolding that I talked about earlier, there are implications for us as teachers, that as we are guiding and scaffolding students from that novice to expert, we're moving students along these continuum. We're taking them from simple ideas to complex ideas, easy tasks or hard tasks. So there's a whole range of continua that we can scaffold the students' learning, making sure that if they're down the novice end, then we are focusing on those issues over there. And as students become more expert, as they become older, more mature, we are shifting what we do towards more this end, because then that replicates the real world. Okay? So as you are planning lessons, as you are thinking about learning experiences, you should be thinking, where are students along this continua? What kind of experiences should I be providing them to move them along? Okay? And so the whole point is to move students from the novice end up to the expert end. Okay? Now, another key person that you will get to know, or if you haven't already, is Lev Vygotsky. So he was into social constructivism, and he came up with this idea of the zone of proximal development. You can read about it if you read this article by Wilson and colleagues, but here is my explanation of the zone of proximal development and how we bring that into teaching in terms of scaffolding. So let's imagine that we had a perfect ruler to measure people's ability to recall timetables, for example. Some of us are going to be good at it, some of us are going to be not so good at it, some of us are really good at it, some of us are going to be really bad at it. Okay? So if we were able to measure everyone's ability within a class and then we graphed it, it kind of look roughly like this. Okay? So there will be, people up the top end, people down the bottom end, but the majority of people will be somewhere in the middle. And if we kind of smooth that out, we end up with a bell curve. Okay? Now, what Lev Vygotsky was talking about was that if we want to challenge students, what we should be doing is pitching the material just beyond where they are currently. Okay? Now, because we have classes of 30, we pretty much have to deal with the majority of students, with a few caveats that I'll get to in a moment. Okay? So if we split the class up into thirds, we've got the high end, we've got the low end, but we've got the majority of students in the middle. If we are applying Lev Vygotsky's idea for that bulk of students in the middle there, we would be targeting those students. Okay? And so what we would be doing is pitching the lesson just beyond what they are currently capable of. Okay? So if we talk about a 3-star system of effort, of setting expectations within a classroom, what we'd be doing is we'd set the middle achievement here at just beyond what students are capable of doing, the majority of students, okay? We would, on some days, they might want to push a bit harder, so what we would do is then provide what we call the big push, the 3-star effort. We define what a 3-star effort would look like. A 1-star effort is if they just coasted, if they just perform like they have always performed, then that's a 1-star. So we will acknowledge that achievement, but it's not as good as, say, a 2-star, which is what we want them. We want them to be able to push themselves beyond what they're currently capable of. Okay? Now, in future lectures, I will go more into the case of what do you do with the students up this end and what do you do with students down the other end, because obviously this criteria, this scaffolding, is only appropriate for the students in the middle, not for all students, but we're here to teach all students. And in future lectures, future tutorials and labs, we'll go through how do you then differentiate? How do you make sure that you are catering for all students in your class? Okay? So a question for you to think about now that we've talked about constructivism, how can you start to apply these ideas in your own learning? Okay? Because then if you can apply these ideas for your own learning, then it's going to be a much simpler transfer for you to apply them for your students' learning in the future. Okay? So in the course of this lecture, we defined key terms, we looked at constructivism as idea, why we will do it, how we will do it, and then we looked at some specific examples of the implications of constructivism for your teaching, and I'll pick these up in future lectures. Thank you very much.